Boom, I am here today to rank every single Thomas Pynchon novel. And I am not only going to rank Pynchon against himself or do some lukewarm optimistic rankings, but rather discuss the transformative elements in each novel and rank Pynchon against the greatest novelists in the world. How does he rank against the Tolstoys, the Melvilles, the Dostoevskys, the Rupi Kaurs? Because being the best writer of your generation, being an innovator, in postmodernist literature is an accomplishment. And like, holy crap, Pynchon is an amazing writer. But will Thomas Pynchon make the canon? And today, you are going to find out all of that and more, because here on Right Conscious, we talk about the best books and authors in the world, and that does include Thomas Pynchon. And that's why, if you look down at the playlist below, you will find dozens of videos just like this, detailing Pynchon's books, his life, and his outlook on so many different issues, which makes it the deepest dive into Pynchon and his work on YouTube. And I believe in a literary renaissance. I believe that we can walk in the footsteps of authors just like Pynchon. And so I just want to give you that positive boost of motivation so that you can get out there and get after it in your reading or in your writing or just in life. And so here we go. First up, we have the boogeyman of Western literature, and that is Gravity's Rainbow. And I break from the pack on this, so I'm going to put this all the way down here at the S tier, everyone, because you can't stop it and you can't deny it. Gravity's Rainbow is the standard for 20th century literature. I've seen countless authors try to write about World War II successfully, or about using psychedelics, or about the occult, the Illuminati, the decay of the state, corporations, characters being programmed, revealing stuff like we're all in the transmutation circle, like Full Metal Alchemist. I've seen it all, but being able to put it all in one novel and somehow make it work and make it entertaining and transformative, my God, that is a very big accomplishment by Pynchon. Does it have problems? Oh yeah. Is it long? Yeah. Is it hard? Yeah. Is your wife that likes to read romanticises ever going to read it? No. Is your husband that grills and chills and chugs beer and ignores the kids ever going to read it? No. But when he throws his beer can at the TV when the Cubs lose the World Series or whatever, you can throw Gravity's Rainbow right behind him, because it's that big of a novel and that destructive of a novel, everybody. But in terms of Gravity's Rainbow's scope, its propheticness, it's wild. Thomas Pynchon knew about the military-industrial complex and what it was and where it was going all the way back in the early 1970s and the 1960s when he started to write this. He knew about the elite's connection to the occult. He knew about these rings of power where sexual deviancy is running rampant and like being used as a form of blackmail. He was blowing the whistle on all the ideas that all the bros now are like, oh my God, look. And that's why it's so good, and that's why it's so relevant, because first of all, it's not something you're supposed to talk about right now. We finally got approval to be a little bit more conspiratorial because of Joe Rogan and Wendigo and all these other people, and it's like, yes. And everyone now knows about MK Ultra and has an edgy opinion about World War II. But all the veterans of World War II are basically dead. And if not, they're old, really old. Even the people that were 5 when it was going on are really old now. Thomas Pynchon in 1970, when he wrote this, was dealing with a generation of veterans and mocking and doing all this stuff and reframing that entire war while they were still alive. Talk about some balls. We haven't had really any modern literary masterpieces. We've had a couple, but we haven't had one on the insanity of the war on terror yet, at least one that's broken through. And I think that's partially because people are scared of what that backlash would look like. But Thomas Pynchon did this while being a former member of the military. Maybe, as some people would say, a member of the intelligence agencies. And talking about conspiracies, I've gotten so many comments over the last couple weeks about people talking about Thomas Pynchon not being real, him being a group, him being an intelligence asset. I know many people who believe, and I don't really know if I subscribe to this, any of this, but that Thomas Pynchon is like AI, like in early uses of AI and all this stuff, and the government releasing psyops. Who knows? But if people are saying that about you, that you're pretty freaking good. But what's awesome about this novel, and this is something that I give a lot of precedence to, and why it's so high on this list, is that he framed so many different things So many different ideas we have about World War II and about the world were being talked about by Pynchon in art all the way back then. And now that I look at my own life and my own thoughts and many of the things I've seen in other books and learned along the way, I've realized that a lot of it actually has root in Thomas Pynchon and in Gravity's Rainbow itself. And so this is going to be a spoiler-free video, but as I always say, in a Thomas Pynchon video, it doesn't really matter because everything goes unresolved anyway. You're never going to be like, damn, you spoiled it. Well, spoiled what? And so Gravity's Rainbow follows many different characters, many different perspectives. It's like endless side quests, but our main hero is this man named Slothrop. And, you already know it's going to be weird when the hero is named Slothrop. And Slothrop at a young age was programmed, and this is going to sound a little bit weird, but it's going to be almost impossible not to sound insane during this video. But Slothrop was conditioned by a Pavlovian Ivy League scientist at Harvard University in the 1920s in a sexual manner, which is already wild. And as an adult, his arousal predicts V2 rocket attacks. And so his cellular body has been colonized by the military industrial complex. It's deeper. We talk about psychological warfare all the time and intelligence agencies. But in this novel, and this is something that Pynchon likes to do time and time again, he makes it biopolitical. And it's fun. It's fun to talk about all the crazy stuff that the Nazis did and the Russians did. And my God, it was wild. But a lot of the time, we don't focus on what we were doing over here in America. We hear about MK Ultra and, how that, and we know now about like what that did to people like Ted Kaczynski and countless others. But we were creating Manchurian candidates and we were doing a million things that the Freedom of Information Act will never tell us about. Let's just be honest here, you guys. The funniest story of the past couple of years, in my opinion, has been like the Epstein stuff. Not that it isn't atrocious, but everyone freaking out saying, we got to have the files. Do you guys think that there's anything actually in there? And if it isn't, it's just not just a targeted hit piece on a group of people. Do you know how much has happened in every country's history that doesn't get written down, that never makes the little file report? Do you really think that in the JFK file, if the CIA actually did it, they would have left those files in there? Honestly, it's just polarization trap and attention grabber after attention grabber to keep people stagnated and not elevated so that we can continue to be oppressed. So funny, bro. The aliens, they're gonna tell us about the aliens. Really? But the entire 20th century was wild psychological warfare because when you look at what was happening back in the day, it was very primitive. It was very barbarian when the torture techniques on point, 10 out of 10. Great job, guys. But the psychological warfare was much harder because the idea of the unconscious didn't exist yet. And psychological warfare is crazy when it's one person. You can manipulate someone. You can do a Ramsey Game of Thrones, thing all day. But what Sigmund Freud and one could say psychology enabled all countries to do in the 20th century was manipulate the masses. And we're still under that duress and still under that control right now, if not more so than ever. And so this novel shows that control across the entire arc, man. It shows it with these characters who are in the war, who are these intelligence assets who are being controlled. It shows women, men, children, all different races and groups of people being controlled, being sucked up into this psychological warfare. And even better, it shows the absurdity, the type of individuals who do this. And what's also absurd is the length of this video, coming in over an hour and 45 minutes. And so I run a Thomas Pynchon book club, everyone, over on my Substack, where I also host the most active book club in the world. We read 6 to 10 transformative novels every single month. Every other book club online reads one a month. We meet up a couple weekends every month, talk about the books. And in 2026, we are going to be reading Pynchon's 3 masterpieces, his 3 longest novels, Gravity's Rainbow, Against the Day, and Mason and Dixon. And next month, in early November, we are going to meet up and have a book club call on Shadow Ticket. And so, first of all, I would love to see you guys in some of those calls. If you guys like this content and want to hang out with me and other cool people who love literature, the book club is the place for you. But if you join my Substack, you also get access to over 100 hours of content just like this, but it's even better. I am free to say whatever I want on Substack. I dive deeper into topics. I go meta. I do live streams. I post my own writing. There is so much cool stuff over there. Plus, Substack is the home of the literary renaissance. The best readers and writers in the world right now, especially those under 40 years old, are all on Substack. And so if you want to write, or if you want to read or watch content on literature or anything that isn't even my stuff, you should go over to Substack. And if you want to check it out, you can go look at my Substack down below, see what I have going on. Plus, I have a ton of free content. There's free content, free live streams dropping every single week. And so go check all of that out, and I will see you guys back in the video in my different outfit. The type of people, I sit around my house all day, you guys. I wake up, I spend time with my family, I read, I write, I take a walk in the woods, maybe go do a hobby, yada, yada, yada. I've basically been doing that my entire life. And there's been acid trips, hundreds of acid trips out in the desert, but all alone. There's a class of individuals who have been programming people and feeling like they are so elite that they can control others, running around now for over 100 years. And what type of person steps into that role, likes that, feels immoral while doing that? Not the best, not people like you and I, most likely, unless you're just a raging psycho. And if you are, more power to you, man. Good job. But you just hear about these countless people in Gravity's Rainbow, and you're just like, oh my God. But when I've gotten to know people in power that have no anywhere near that level of power, but successful business people and artists who are just like C tier, maybe like low B tier in terms of success. Many of them didn't get there through genuine, entrepreneurship or this stuff, but through weird networking and manipulation and extortion, a lot of that stuff. And I've met a couple that have been good, but a lot of them have a lot of idiosyncratic behavior. Because especially now with the opportunities that power presents, it gets crazier and crazier. But those people just have business opportunities, artistic opportunities. Imagine being the feds. Imagine having the power to delete people, to do whatever you want and cover it up. Plus everything that these superstars and business people get. You can get the money, the women, and all of that. And so this novel is brutal though, because it shows what's actually happening, you guys. There's a lot of heartbreaking stuff in here. This novel takes place at the end of World War II, and then after it's done, right after it's done. And the consolidation of power and how basically everything was open, who's in charge? Nobody. And there are all these groups of people with guns and power, these intelligence groups just running around exploiting people. And because there's so much displacement, what does that mean? A lot of the time it means sexual exploitation of, people of all ages. There's a lot of that going on in this novel, and it's really hard to read, but it's what happened. And as we've seen with Epstein, it's what's continued to happen. And when you understand history, it is history. And so I recommend when you to read the companion guide when you do this. So there's a Gravity's Rainbow companion guide. And another reason why this novel is so great is that if you read the companion, or if not, but if you research what you were reading, or just read it for fun once and then reread it and then research, you're going to learn a lot that you've never known before. And you're going to see things applied in a way that are just artistically masterful. For instance, I'm translating Rilke right now for my book, Desert Orpheus. I'm translating his 55 poems in his collection, Sonnets to Orpheus. I've been a fan of Rilke for over a decade. I've been inundated into many different aspects of the occult and the Kabbalah for 13, 14 years now. I've known all about it. Watching Thomas Pynchon use Rilke as an image patterning device and as occulted coded text, using the Kabbalah in the ways that he does in this are he hides it. I don't know everything that he did with it. I'm just watching and all is he doing that again? What's he doing here? And you can get opened up to so many different new ideas and possibilities that are endless, that are crazy. And so you're not only going to leave Gravity's Rainbow as a smarter individual just because you read it. First of all, you're going to be wow, I did that. But because you're going to be, drawn into things that interest you, which can lead into so many different things. It's not like reading 12 rules for life or something like that. A chain reaction isn't necessarily happening even when you read something like Tommy Orange's There or something like that. But also, if you read Gravity's Rainbow, you're going to become more anti-government. And I'm not saying you're going to become a libertarian or go full lit bro David Koresh on us. And if you do that though, please invite me, take a bunch of your members' money and, come invite me. We'll do $100,000 speaking fee or something, and I'll rant. That'd be great for the next David Koresh. If there's a literary David Koresh, let's go. But if you read this, you're really not going to trust what's happening on both sides. And you can play these false equivalent games and be like, see, this side's better, worse, vote for the lesser of two evils never. That's like saying choose Coke or Dr. Pepper. You're going to really get into that mindset. Really be that guy who everyone likes to call out. That's just a cop-out. You have to play the game. You have to fall into the trap. If you're not in the trap, you're not making a difference. It's wokeism. It's fascism. But Pynchon shows through, he personifies the absurdity of both sides of government. He shows how they act. He shows what's really going on behind the scenes of the military-industrial complex and the universities and all these different places. He shows the roots of it all and shows the darkness of it. And when they are built like that, I really don't think you can really change it. We talk about it all the time. And Pynchon's on point on so many different things. He talks about the Middle East in this, his opinion, on point. He's already talking about Israel in Gravity's Rainbow and continues in almost every single one of his novels. Plus, when it's easy to read, it's easy to read. When you hit these sections, it feels like you're flying, man. And I think that everyone could read Gravity's Rainbow. It's kind of held up as this crazy novel, right? And you've heard me build it up, and it's going to be hard. But I think if you commit to finishing it, and you trust me when I say that you won't be the same person once you finish this, then, give it a go when you have the chance. If you're stressed out, if you just had a kid, or something like that, don't start it. But, if you have some time off, it's the summer or cozy winter read. And when I compare it to a lot of these other novels behind me, speaking of the canon, it's hard to not love it because of how imaginative it is. Because, for instance, I love my boy Dostoevsky. I sat here and read the 1,100-page biography, read all of his novels, taking my book club through all of his works. But as a contemporary reader, when you read his works, it feels gaggy a lot of the time. You can see the setups, you can see the absurdities, you can see a lot of the problems with the writing, honestly. And Dostoevsky was an innovator. That's why he's an S-tier novelist. There are a lot of ideas in there that are really important and the first ones and are groundbreaking and influenced everybody else. I've made countless videos on how Dostoevsky influenced Yukio Mishima and Hemingway and David Foster Wallace and Cormac McCarthy, all these different people. Countless videos on it. But here's something to think about. I think when people 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, look back at a novel that was written in 1970 or 1873, they're not going to see that much difference between the times. For instance, if I told you right now about a novel from, or a story, whatever, a poem from 1230 or 1330, unless you're a whiz, and there's a lot of whizzes out there, a lot of my really smart bros out there, you're not going to really know the difference in between that 100 years and really care about the difference. And yes, between 1860 and 1960, the greatest technological revolution ever happened. And there'll probably be another one like that. And so that's a really big deal. But over time, when people look back at it, historically, it starts to blend together. And so when I think of what novels and masterpieces are going to be like in the future, I think they're going to be a lot more like a Gravity's Rainbow than an Anna Karenina or a Brothers Karamazov or even, and I hate to say this, my favorite book of all time, a Moby Dick, even though I think Moby Dick's better than Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Shout out. Gravity's Rainbow is not better than Moby Dick, by the way. And the other problem is that novels like Moby Dick have almost been overthrown. Their lineage has continued. And at some level, Pynchon, we have David Foster Wallace, House of Leaves, countless other, postmodernist, maximalist novelists that have come through and innovated, but we're still kind of chasing that. We're still chasing. I talked about this on Substack today. Our first technological novel, our first novel for our century, for our time, for our current crisis that we're going through. And until we get that, I think that Gravity's Rainbow is going to be the standard. And whatever that is, and it could take decades to get there, it's going to be derivative of this novel. And so for me, S tier for sure. Imagination, vision, execution, it can be long, but with a lot of these novels, once you're done reading it, you feel more intelligent, you feel more awake, and you start framing reality through the novel you just read. And whenever that happens, I feel like, especially in mass, and a lot of people are doing it, not just random people, or a small group of people, then I feel like that hits S tier, especially if it's conscious. If a bunch of people read a romantasy, that's not it. They just got emotionally jolted. This jolts your entire soul. It helps you awaken in a intellectual, emotional, and spiritual manner. And so, I could go on and on, you guys, about this book. But without spoilers, it makes it kind of hard. And so we will be reading this in the Right Conscious Book Club in 2026 alongside 3 of Against the Day, Shadow Ticket, which we'll be reading next month, and Mason and Dixon. And so just a reminder for you guys. So next up, we have, and I didn't make this list, shout out to whoever did, we have Inherent Vice, and I'm going to put Inherent Vice at a C. A high C. I think it's going to be around a 79. And I think it's a good time now to kind of talk because I get angry comments every single day. The funny thing about being in the literature world, and a lot of booktubers have to experience this. Luckily, I've been in the game for like 8 years, so I'm used to it, is that there are so many smart people in this world. There are people more intelligent than me in a logical way, in an emotional way, in various topics. And as a commentator, you eventually, and as an author, you eventually piss a lot of them off. And a lot of people are reasonable people and see art as this ever expanding thing that doesn't always need to be better and can be derivative and still be a masterpiece or good. But I got this comment today, and I've got this comment hundreds of times. These people act like their logical framing is original when it's actually the easiest way to frame reality and think about a thing. But he said, Pynchon blew his wad with Gravity's Rainbow. He was done. Then in 1990, he got married, had a kid, and decided he needed a boost in his income with another novel. His literary agent wife probably agreed, so he published Vineland. On a scale where Gravity's Rainbow is a 10, Vineland is a 2. Have you no conscience, right conscious, pretending this burnt out case has anything left to say? And he also says that Pynchon's Inherent Vice was derivative of Roger Simone Moses's wine novels and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think he ever heard the quote, and I'm sure did, and threw it out, that the Cormac McCarthy quote, that books are made out of books. I've been to the David Foster Wallace Archive, the Cormac McCarthy Archive, and archives of other authors and studied their drafts, spent weeks there just looking at how they wrote these masterpiece novels like a Blood Meridian. And what I learned is they just basically stole. I mean, a lot of ideas were original, but something like Blood Meridian was, he found this thing like the Glanton Gang and just built a story around it and stole countless lines, countless sentences, countless ideas, countless framings, literally were stolen from authors. Like we say, imitate. And he wasn't stealing like line for line, but he'd see a word that Tim O'Brien would word. Tim O'Brien said phallic in this way. I'm going to use it the exact same way in this context. Just stealing left and right, derivative left and right. Blood Meridian is derivative of Moby Dick and Dostoevsky. McCarthy's Southern novels are derivative of William Faulkner. Does that not make them masterpieces? Isn't everything derivative of something else? And people will say, we haven't moved past the slow cinema. Film is still dipping back into the 60s and we've never moved on and yada, yada, yada. And I get that point of view. I get how Inherent Vice and Pynchon's turn toward the pulp, which I'm going to talk about at length in this video, maybe I'll start right now, can be very confusing. And I also think that Thomas Pynchon and Cormac McCarthy had a very similar path. Cormac McCarthy writes Blood Meridian and Suttree, which are two of the greatest novels ever written, and then writes the Border Trilogy, which is way more accessible. He changes his publisher. He marries this vastly younger girl and becomes like the superstar. Like he meant to become a superstar. He wrote the Border Trilogy, not because it was the unconscious idea in his heart, but he wanted to write something that would sell well, that would make him millions of dollars. But it's interesting because in retrospect, I think that one could learn more about the world and about life through Cormac McCarthy's Border Trilogy, and I would say that you could learn more about life, even though it's not rated as high, in some of Pynchon's more recent novels, his more pulp novels, than you could in A Gravity's Rainbow. Because a lot of people, blow their wad. What does that mean? Well, he's talking about everything I just talked about. He's talking about all the knowledge in here, all these little hidden occult things and all this knowledge and all that. And there's this standard, especially the type of person who will leave a comment like this, who will say it's derivative, art is, in decline, all of this stuff, that they are logic bros, that they like to view things through this logical reality, and they need it to be this epic, maximalist, next level thing for it to impact them. But in actuality, what are we trying to do with literature? What are you trying to do with the book? Are you just trying to impress this group of lit bros, this minute group, so that they can circle jerk around your work? Honestly, is that what you're trying to do? And a lot of authors say yes. I was there at one point, like, I'm going to be the next Thomas Pynchon. I'm going to be the next Cormac McCarthy. Everyone's going to know about me, bro, blah, blah, blah. Like, I get that energy and I love it. And like, for the love of God, we need more of that. And like, keep going if you're like that. I'm not criticizing that. But at some point, as an author. I think a lot of us realize that in Pynchon's case with Gravity's Rainbow, he became a superstar. But for many authors, they write these complex novels and it doesn't sell millions of copies like Gravity's Rainbow or Infinite Jest. And they're like, why am I doing this? Who am I writing for? And am I having fun doing this? Am I bringing a certain energy to the table that's going to be uplifting? Because as you get older, you can't continue to have that youthful, fiery, I'm going to create the most epic thing of all time energy. You change, you become more universal, more cheesy, more of these things as you get older. And does that mean that you are a worse writer a lot of the times? Sometimes, yes. And, I'm not rating this as highly as Gravity's Rainbow, but I think the framing that just because something is derivative or not as serious or not as lit bro-y or as epic is a little bit unfounded and silly, because circling back to the idea, what's the goal of all this? The goal that I'm trying to promote with the literary renaissance is that literature is the best artistic medium to lift people to a mental, spiritual, and emotional baseline so that we can live in a more nonviolent and happy society. With literature has helped me do that countless times in poetry and nonfiction and other things. And so is music and all that. But in terms of long-term development and thinking and, developing these critical thinking skills and becoming a more conscious person and having some complexity with the reference that we pin against, events in our own life and in society and in our family, yada, yada, yada. Literature has much more depth than what you could find in movies and in film and in music. Music is the best at instantly lifting you into whatever state or mindset or whatever that you want to be in. But how long does that last? And do you need these repeated experiences? And most of the time it is yes. I mean, with the really good stuff, it can really show you a new framing of reality and like a new feeling, and you can carry that on forever. But with many books, I still daily refer to events and things through that framing of the novel. And we've reached the point in society where people no longer want to integrate the novels they are reading. They just want to be, oh, I read this, I read that, I read that. They just want to be this intellectual person. They got intellectually, educationally traumatized in school and want to continue down this path of, being the grade A student or the misunderstood kid who nobody got. And, I'm so talented, and want to continue consuming knowledge and not integrating it into their soul. And so any work that helps people touch on these, brings forth transformative elements, whether it's derivative or not, doesn't matter. But why did I give this a 79? Here I am on my high horse, but still giving it a bad grade. Well, 79 is not bad. Honestly, most novels that are being released right now are like in the 20s and 30s. If you get up into the 80s and the 90s, we're talking about masterpieces here. That's something a lot of people, freak out over these tier list videos. And it's like, dude, 99% of books are in the D tier. If you make it to the C tier, if I could get a novel or a poetry book in my own C tier, I'd be so happy. One of the failures I feel like with Inherent Vice is that whatever novel, that pulpy novel that dude just referenced by Moses or whoever that is, I'm sure doesn't have the beauty and style and the cultural depth of this novel. I can guarantee it. The themes and stuff that Pynchon is touching on, none of these pulp authors are doing that back then and doing that still. Like, there are obviously exceptions, but in general, they are not. But Gravity's Rainbow forces you to research. But Inherent Vice is so accessible and so fun, it doesn't really feel like you need to research. And if you don't have the prerequisitory knowledge and you just read it, then I don't really feel like some of the transformative elements come forth, but I really feel like some of the deeper cuts don't. And Pynchon doesn't really prompt you to feel like you need to research some of this stuff. And I feel like this is actually the big problem with Shadow Ticket too. Like, there's all this stuff going on that's really genius and really these kind of cool critiques and like really important stuff for even us today. But I think that most readers, and Thomas Pynchon readers are pretty smart. But I read these books to talk about it in video. So I have to read closely, and I go and read guides and get opinions and do all this stuff. And I've joined clubs. I've been a part of these book clubs before online when I read like Pynchon novels and McCarthy novels. I hear these opinions. I read journal articles and secondary sources. I try to get all this information out there. So it all I go to the archives, like eventually all this information and these ideas come forth to me. And eventually, because this is now like my full-time job and I've been reading books for such a long time, like at mass, some of these ideas like just kind of come out to me and I can kind of see what's going on. But if you don't know the history of I think a lot of people know like stuff about this, hippie movement, the 60s, the early 70s. People know about that. And so you can kind of come into this and see a lot of that stuff and understand it. But I don't think a lot of people really understand or have gotten too deep into. And, books like that new Chaos book and other things have kind of helped the CIA's infiltration of that movement and basically creation of the hippie movement, creation of the Grateful Dead. Shout out Grateful Dead. Love Europe 72, my favorite band. Shout out Fish. Let's go jam bands. Nonetheless, the creation and elevation of these people to create a pacified anti-war movement that wouldn't stop the Vietnam War. The intelligence agency's roles in, taking down Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, the Black Panther movement, all these different groups, the American Indian movement, John Trudell. It could just go on and on and on. And even more importantly, like in this novel, how much do you know about the suburbanization of La Habra? Do you know what La Habra is? Do you know about the California water wars? Do you know about all this underground stuff with all the drugs and the corruption of the police force and all of that stuff? And I'm not lecturing like you need to know that. You don't need to know everything. I'm not sitting here like, oh, you're a fucking idiot because you don't know. But that stuff's like a layer or two deeper than even common knowledge for like a Pynchon reader or like a literary reader. And a lot of my monsters out there right now that have made it this far in this video, you guys know all that. But I feel like, a novel shouldn't just be, and especially an accessible novel, shouldn't just be for the bros, but for everybody. And in this one and in Shadow Ticket, it doesn't come forth. And so this novel focuses on the fallout of the hippie movement. And it's one of my favorite times because I actually feel like we're in a parallel universe right now. I know so many people, and this is no diss, who are trying to return to this traditionalist mindset. They're returning to like traditional ways of living, and that's cool. Like, let's go analog. Let's be pagans again. Let's be Orthodox Christians again, whatever. But during these times, if you actually look back over the last 10 years, there was this psychedelic boom. When I was in high school in 2007 in Las Vegas, which was, one could say a progressive place, marijuana was not cool. People were like that, like it was not the cool drug. And it wasn't until there was this psychedelic revival that was kind of spearheaded by like Joe Rogan and people and the legalization of weed in California and like a couple other events that made it cool again. But then, because of social media and all this, throughout the 2010s, people got back into, there was a new age spirituality revival. There was like the ayahuasca, let's fly to a foreign country and do drugs revival, which happened in the 60s and 70s. There was obviously the party psychedelic revival. Like there was all of this stuff going on. And what's interesting is that if you come to recreational drugs and especially psychedelic drugs from an ungrounded place and you just take them, you are basically just becoming hyper suggestible and more of what you already are. Psychedelic drugs, most of the time, are meant to be used in a traditional way as a way of healing, and in classic societies were only meant to be used by the shaman, not the random dude who, in the tribe. And that's why so many people have bad trips and all this. And the real way to experience this is if you go do a 3-day ayahuasca ceremony, plus if you get really intense and do sweat lodges before and sweat lodges after, and you really take like that practice and that idea and all this stuff seriously, it is a vastly different experience. Like night and day from even going out by yourself and taking a bunch of acid or mushrooms or DMT on your own. When you do that, you get all these revelations and it's crazy and you break through all these barriers, but there is no grounding, there is no tradition, there is no system. It's like you're, going to the gym and just training yourself. There are plenty of bros out there. And for a while I was in this group who you go to the gym, you follow some online guides, and you can get ripped, you can get strong, you can look real good. And you never get a personal trainer or a coach. And so, yeah, you're ripped. You know what's going on. Good job. But if that entire time you were being coached, not by some random dumb personal trainer at some, Planet Fitness type gym, but rather like someone who's really good, you would be way further ahead of where you are at right now. And maybe not in strength or physique, but just in like longevity, because your form would be better. Like all these things like matter. And the same is true with what I feel like psychedelics. There are a ton of people out there who've gotten these benefits. They're ripped, they're strong, they've utilized it for good. Plus there's a bunch of people who've burned out and like the system didn't work and they're fat now and injured or whatever, have screwed their bodies up or are never going to do it again because they had a bad time at the gym and it wasn't worth it or whatever. But could have gone so much further if they actually had a system behind it. Because all of my friends who didn't take that, I would say everyone I know who didn't take that more traditional, trying to find healing and assist them with their psychedelic use is now the exact same as all my friends who didn't take psychedelics. Yeah, they had this crazy trip. Maybe they understand a little bit more about the other universe and all of this stuff. But there's little to no separation, because to live an authentic life, to live a life where you're actually trying to make a change, where you're being conscious, is a practice of daily dedication. But when you open yourself up and you become hypersuggestible, what you become is hypersuggestible. You intake the culture, the media, what all these things even more, but eventually you'll reach a point where you feel empty, where it's over. And this is why so many hippies, and Thomas Pynchon explores this in his novel Vineland and in Inherent Vice, became snitches, became yuppies. This is why we're having this return to people who want community and tradition, and they are moving out and starting hobby farms and homesteads and all this stuff, and it's fine. But this is what created situations like the People's Temple, run by Jim Jones. Everyone was so washed out on drugs that they said, wow, there's this commune up in Ukiah, California, and I can go up there and just, have this, nice way of living. It's structured. I give up all my stuff away. I don't have anything. And how did that work out? How did the 70s work out? And we're in this cultural cycle that continues on and on. And Pynchon, in many of his novels, kind of talks about the fallout of this. And like I said, it's really relevant to us right now. But a lot of it really isn't explored, He'll say, they'll talk about the Manson family, everyone thinks hippies are the bad guys now and all of this stuff. And we see, the exploitation of minors and other things through drugs and through power in this novel and all of this stuff. And, these hippie centers of Reformation, all these things that were happening and are actually happening right now, all these different cults, all these different little groups where people are going, it's all real. And so there are a lot of transformative elements here, but once again, it's only for the person who knows that this happened in the first place. And if you want to get something from it right now, to know that we're going through something very similarly, and we'll probably do it again in another, 3 or 4 decades. And Thomas Pynchon, a lot of the time with his novels, isn't trying to give us a field guide to trauma or how to live our lives or to the CIA or so many of these other things. That's not his goal. He's trying to kind of show the experience of knowing. He's trying to give us this map of reality and experience. But in this one, I don't really feel like Doc Sportello, the protagonist of this novel, pushes those boundaries very far, And that's kind of the gag, that he is this hippie guy, this hippie private investigator, and, he'll just get high or give up. But there is a love angle connection in this. There are a couple things that really should take this to the next level, but it never gets off the ground in a very meaningful way, in my opinion. And I think that's why it struggles. And I don't think Pynchon knew when he was writing this in the early 2000s that we would experience like a similar cycle in the early 2020s or whatever. But to return to the point that I started with, did Pynchon just start writing these novels for the money? Not exactly, but he had this goal that I think Vineland and Bleeding Edge, which we'll talk about in a second, accomplish a little bit more, and maybe some of his historical novels, but Inherent Vice and Shadow Ticket don't. But that could just be a thing of us being so separated, of these novels being not historical. Like Shadow Ticket isn't a historical novel because it's 1930, but one could say Against the Day, which takes place in the 1890s, can start slipping into that, and Mason and Dixon is historical. So it's not a historical novel, but it's also not a contemporary novel. When I read Inherent Vice, a lot of the time the nostalgia machine doesn't turn up. And when you look at people like a Cormac McCarthy, a Don DeLillo, even though you guys can't see his book over there, Dennis Johnson's, the Dennis Johnsons, when they write about this time period, they turn up the smoke. They in a somewhat similar maximalist style with all these injunctions and side quests, side characters, rants, all of this really make me feel something, really make me contemplate this time period and what's going on in it. And they don't need this extra information. Like I said, that's somewhat required to understand what Pynchon is doing here. And even if you do understand what Pynchon is doing here, talking about the suburbanization and the fallout of the hippie movement and all of that, he really doesn't see a lot of that through either. And this is something that a lot of older novelists kind of fall into. The energy is gone, the spark is gone. And it's not that they're trying to be commercial. It's just that youthful energy, that vision that somehow can tie everything together and everything is touched and everyone leaves the book feeling satisfied can somewhat fade away. Dostoevsky, even though he wrote The Brothers Karamazov at the end of his life, he wasn't 80 years old. He wasn't 70 years old. He was in his mid to late 50s, and Pynchon was in his mid to late 60s when he wrote this. And I think if you kind of look at the history of literature, you look at Moby Dick, that's a young man's story. And, by the time Melville was in his late 60s, early 70s, he was writing Billy Budd. Still a deviation, still downstream. We could look at Philip Roth and the end of his career. Cormac McCarthy with The Road, No Country for Old Men, and The Passenger don't count because he was working on those since the 60s and the 70s. Don DeLillo with many of his novels. Toni Morrison with her book of Mercy. I can go on and on. And it's not to say they aren't good novels or transformative novels, but it's really hard, I think, to capture that energy of when you're in your 40s and early 50s and have the energy still, but then the life experience and have, tens of thousands of hours, put into the game. How can you beat that? And so I would recommend this novel. This is one of the better novels I talk about in one of my early videos to get into. If you are new to reading Pynchon, if you're really into this time period, I would recommend it. If you like to have movie companions to the books you are reading, then it's a really good idea. And so boom, there we go, everyone. Moving forward, our next novel on the list is Bleeding Edge, and I'm going to throw Bleeding Edge up here in the B. And so Bleeding Edge was Thomas Pynchon's 2013 novel, as you guys can see right here. And I would say that I do love this book. And this book has its own problems, but I feel like Pynchon really tapped into something in Bleeding Edge that I would say kind of pushed him to bring out some of his better qualities. Inherent Vice is a little bit more, I don't want to say authentic, but one can say believable than a Bleeding Edge because Pynchon was there. He was living it. And Pynchon did live through the early 2000s in New York City, which is where Bleeding Edge takes place. But one of the hardest things to do for an author in today's world is to write a transformative masterpiece about technology or about dealing with this modern crisis we are all facing. We haven't had, this is crazy, you guys. Something I'm going to repeat time after time and something you need to think about. The number one thing on our minds right now is that since the 1990s, when Infinite Jest sold millions of copies or 1 million copies and has now, since then sold a lot more, we haven't had a transformative novel sell very big. I wouldn't throw Bleeding Edge or Inherent Vice in that epic transformative novel category. We haven't had a literary celebrity on the transformative literary side since David Foster Wallace died. And by the time, the mid 2000s hit, he was already kind of fading away. It's been decades. If you go back to the 1960s, the 1940s, the 1980s, there were countless literary celebrities that were out there pushing the work, putting this persona out there. And we have none of that now. And I talk about on this channel why that happened, and we don't need to do that here. But one of the main reasons is that there are countless people out there writing these historical novels, these westerns, these sci-fis, these fantasies, and that's great, and continue writing what you want to write. But no one has been able to capture, or I should say not enough writers have been able to capture what we're going through in our technological isolation in this cultural wasteland good enough for there to be a breakthrough yet. Because someone will comment down below, my novel is doing this. But when you look at past breakthrough novels, there were plenty of people attempting it. The sentiment was out there, but there had to be enough people for something to break through. And right now, we don't have the sheer numbers of authors really writing about the modern crisis that we are facing for one to catapult itself. Because how easy would it be to sell you guys? Here I am selling you guys on some 2013 novel about the early 2000s. What if I said right now, there's this new novel. It's selling like crazy. It's not, and it speaks to everything that we are going through right now. It is the gravity's rainbow of our time. If I got up here and told you that, and then you didn't just hear it from me, but you heard it from a bunch of other people, you would go buy and read that book. Millions of people would go and buy and read that book within the year. And the publishing industry has tried to sell us time and time again that this is that novel or blah, 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 but there has been nothing close yet. At least that's in the public eye. And for whatever reason, it has to be the perfect combination of things, because there are authors out there who are amazing, who are writing that novel, but it just isn't hitting. It just isn't exactly right yet. But I feel like one of the closest things that we have to that is Bleeding Edge by Thomas Pynchon. And so there is a lot of meandering in this novel, I will tell you. There is more meandering and rants and side quests than in Inherent Vice, and I consider a lot of them somewhat useless. But when this novel is hitting, when this novel is talking about what matters to us as Americans, it speaks with much more clarity than like a shadow ticket or an inherent vice. And I think that's really important because I get it with Pynchon that, like I said, it's about knowing and testing the limits of experience and the mazes of consciousness and life and society. And it isn't a field guide to realization. But if I'm going to dump hours into reading this novel from a genius of our time who's commentating on technology, commentating on 9/11, on politics, on all these things that we're dealing with today, then my God, especially as someone who was doing it, in the late 2000s and early 2000s and 10s before he finished this, then man, I want to leave with something. And Pynchon gives it to us. Pynchon, multiple times throughout this novel, tells us exactly how we are feeling, exactly what is happening with our society and where we are heading with virtual, with AI and virtual reality and all of this stuff. And he does it through his own style. He builds it up. He image patterns all of it through this concept of Bleeding Edge. So Bleeding Edge is a novel that takes place in September 2001, before, during, and after the events of 9/11. It follows Maxine, this private investigator who gets linked up to this told to investigate into this like Elon Musk type billionaire who is, gotten out of the .com bust of, Silicon Valley and come to New York City and is trying something similarly over here, trying to kind of get his hands into Washington, D.C. and all of this stuff. And Pynchon takes a very radical view and talks about September 11th in an unconventional fashion. I won't spoil it for you guys. He also explores the role of billionaires and corporations in the war on terror and the formation of it and in our conception of the Middle East and our relationship to it. He talks about this game, Bleeding Edge, which is this virtual reality open source game that Maxine's friends have invented, and talks about the spiritual components of video games, of the technological world. These are all things that are very interesting and haven't been explored very well. And I get it. On like Reddit boards and on the 4chan boards, there have been people who have talked about all of this stuff ad infinitum, but how many people have done it in the form of the novel? Not too many. And the ones that have usually don't have the gift that Pynchon has that I talked about earlier of being able to be sentimental, to be emotional, and also be very knowledgeable. Because one of the problems of a lot of writers is that many times when they start writing about technology or about, virtual reality, it starts slipping into sci-fi real fast. It starts slipping into speculative fiction really fast. But by grounding this in 2001, in the past, he is commentating on our reality now, and he knows it. He's showing us the origin, the loss of the arcades, the loss of the technological world that we grew up in that maybe had a glimmer of hope in it, and now in the corporation-controlled internet. He doesn't get lost. And, like I said, I've tried so many novels like this, and they've been good for me, but there's all this technical jargon, this lit bro jargon, this tech bro jargon in a lot of these works and in these short stories. And that doesn't get my heartstrings going. It feels like some little kid, some guy who spent way too much time on his computer is writing it. Bleeding Edge does not feel like that. But if you had no idea who Thomas Pynchon was, and let's say you picked up this novel and you knew a lot about the tech world and technology and all this stuff, and you read this, you'd be like, damn, this guy must be really into all of this stuff. He's talking about Akira and Ghost in the Shell, all of this stuff, talking about programming languages. And it's a real accomplishment for him to be able to do that, to get someone, no one, Cormac McCarthy, Don DeLillo, a lot of these old figures, born in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we never really got them. Never had any commentary from them on technology, on the internet, on video games, on really any of these things. It's actually kind of crazy. Even David Foster Wallace only wrote one essay on the internet. It was, really unexplored up until his death, which by the time that hit in 2007, 2008, the internet was booming by then. And so it's really cool to see someone with that talent, with that mentality, come to this and with an open mind, not with a stubborn mind. This book isn't a rebuke necessarily against technology, but rather a warning about where we are taking it. And so because of those things, and like I said, there are a lot of problems in this novel, but I sat down and reread this. I remember reading this in like 2014 or something when I first got into Pynchon. But recently for our Right Conscious Book Club, I sat down and my wife was going out or doing something. I can't remember exactly what, but she was going to be gone. I sat down and read this cover to cover. Took me 5 or 6 hours. Like, I went to the bathroom, I had some leftovers, and I just sat there. I went from the couch to sitting outside. And that's it. Like, I was immersed in this. And it's actually, I've never, like, with Thomas Pynchon, that's like really hard to do, honestly. Like, try to do that with many of his other works. The one might be too long, but two, like, trying to get a couple hundred pages done of his works is like really hard on the brain. But for some reason, I love this. I think it has problems on a narrative level, on the side quest level, that really prevent it from going to the A or the S category. I don't think it has the scope. It could be a length thing, may not be long enough. And I don't know. And I feel like Pynchon's ability got stretched here. I don't know who was feeding him this information. I don't know if his son, who was, young and growing up with technology during this time, helped, awaken him to some of these possibilities and to some of these ideas, or who was helping him, who was researching. Novels like this kind of lend to the idea that Thomas Pynchon isn't a person, but rather a group of people, a psyop, an intelligence agent, early uses of AI. Like, we all know, hopefully that the government has had a lot of the technology that we have, way before we have it, at least primitive forms of it. So anyway, like, there's a lot of theories out there, not that I really buy into them, but when you read something like this, you're like, where did this dude in his late 60s get all this information? Because I remember when my grandparents were in their late 60s and we tried to give them flip phones, back, in the late 2000s, they couldn't handle it. And so, really good stuff. But I feel like the length, I feel like this already coming in at, 450 pages was stretching Pynchon's ability to really write about technology and some of this stuff. Some of it reads a little bit wonky, one can say, even when he's writing about the video game stuff. Like, you could see some deficiencies in his thought here, and I think that's what prevents it from, if I'm going to talk about, the greatest works of all time, works that really capture this stuff. Like I said, it's good because it's one of the only things that does it well, and especially from an authoritative stylistic voice, a master of the craft, that drives it up. But there are things that, really prevent it from, like, getting into that A and S category with, some of the greatest books of all time behind me. And so that's my thoughts on it. Do you guys agree with that? How do you guys like my picks so far? Like, list your picks. If you've read Thomas Pynchon, if you're still here with me, tell me your rankings down below. Use this S, A, B, C, D tier and throw it in there and compare it to what you can conceptualize as the greatest works of all time. We all have a different definition, but I think that at some level also a lot of that stuff is, similar. So returning to our list, shout out Bleeding Edge. Love that novel. Next we have Thomas Pynchon's, like I said, I don't know if I want to call this a historical novel, pre-World War I, late 19th century novel, Against Today. And I'm going to throw this up here ahead of Bleeding Edge in the B category. And I'm going to give this I don't know, I would say like an 85, out of 100 in my opinion. And the reason is this, I feel, and I get what Pynchon, like the guy earlier, very reductive viewpoint. He just wanted the money. Why did he write Mason and Dixon and Against Today if he was just in it for the money? Like, these aren't marketable books necessarily. And so with Against Today, I feel like something happened with Pynchon. I feel like, and I think this happens to a lot of us as we get older. I think he looked at Gravity's Rainbow, something that he wrote in his late 20s, early 30s, as yes, this masterpiece, but almost that, symphony of schizo ideas and energy that we all have. Like, I have moved off a lot of the more insane worldviews that I've had about, conspiracies or whatever back when I was like in my 20s. I've told you guys this before, but I grew up in Las Vegas and I used to go to all the conferences, whatever it was. Like, I'm really into like healthy eating. So I would go to the paleo diet conference because a bunch of these conferences come to Vegas. And so I went to like countless like spirituality conferences, alien conferences. Like, I just go to whatever, the book festivals. Vegas is awesome for that. People don't realize that. I'd also go to these conspiracy conferences and I heard anything and everything, like as deep as you want to go. Stuff that would get you deplatformed from YouTube immediately. Stuff that Wendy Goon in his 10-hour iceberg video, like, is afraid to touch or doesn't even know exists. And I'm not trying to say like I'm better than him or any of that, because that stuff's all schizo. Like, it's not even like, there's a reason why you don't go out there in the weeds a lot of the time, because it's too wild. But I was out there and I have been kind of reeled back in a little bit as I've gotten older, and I'm more focused now on the idea, like, I realized one day, like, even if all of this is true, like, what if all of it's true? The craziest thing you believe is true. Well, the mission is still the same. We have to get out here and educate people and elevate people. It doesn't matter if Donald Trump or Kamala Harris wins, we're still going to be getting screwed. No, one side's not. We don't have the education right now. We don't have the collective level of intellect and emotionality and everything else to elect good leaders on whatever side of the aisle. And so that's when I said, I'm going to detach from all that and focus on the mission, because without that, we'll just be circling the drain and getting not just subpar, but like terrible choices, and continuing to move less and less away from like true freedom, not the libertarian freedom or whatever that is, but just like collective freedom, like free thinking, all these things that we hold dear. And so anyway, this is all in service to talk about against the day, because I have been reeled back in a little bit, and I can only imagine by the time I'm in my 40s and 50s, I might be reeled in more. And something interesting about Pynchon is when you read Gravity's Rainbow, for a young man who was raised in the 60s and went through all of that, he was exposed to the darkness. He was exposed to the dark occult, to many psychedelics and many of these rituals. And if he was researching all this, and I'm not saying, like I said, he was sacrificing pigs or a part of the Illuminati or doing chaos magic or anything like that, but he saw all that and he saw the power in that. And I think that's what gave him the power to write something as good as Gravity's Rainbow. And it's very similar to authors who are on drugs. They have this power when they're young, and Stephen King doing cocaine, and he's writing The Shining and doing all this, but then eventually they get sober and they struggle. Well, I think the same is true with a lot of this stuff, and I have felt this too, that once you move away from the crazy stuff, once you move away from the darkness, once you get off of the drugs and you orient yourself in the light, it can become much harder to create good art. And we've actually seen that happen in history. I mean, many times, but art, a lot of our conception of literature is based on tragedy, right? And the only author I've seen who has written non-tragic novels that are masterpieces, that are canonical, in my opinion, is my boy Tom Robbins. Shout out to him, one of the greatest American novelists ever. Jitterbug Perfume, Still Life with Woodpecker. He doesn't need to get into these Shakespearean tragedy tropes. He doesn't need to polarize himself in, the canonical lineage of the Bible or any of this stuff. He just escapes a lot of that and built an entire system himself, but he was doing that from a young age. He was oriented into the light, speaking of these authors from the 1960s. He didn't take this dark path that Pynchon and McCarthy took. And so eventually when you try to come back, and luckily Cormac McCarthy never really tried to do this, when you try to come back, and I see this in Shadow Ticket, I see this in Inherent Vice, I see this in Bleeding Edge, I see this in Against the Day, a little bit less in Vineland, and in Mason and Dixon, I feel like that's Mason and Dixon was something that he worked on, as we'll talk about in a minute, for 23 years. And so that was, old guard for him. Anyway, I see this movement toward, for lack of a better word, the light, higher level, higher modalities of consciousness, which aren't as well explored in terms of creating art through, especially literature. Like I said, because we've all been Dostoevsky pilled and Shakespeare pilled, and like all of our cinema and art and all this stuff. And so Pynchon, I think, and this is something I believe too, is that as modern artists, one of the more innovative things you can do is say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something different. Like, I'm going to try to be just as innovative on the opposite side of the dialect. And so in Against the Day, I really feel like this is like Pynchon's attempt to do something like a Gravity's Rainbow, but on this side. I think that, I don't want to say he fails because he gets an 85 out of 100, which puts it with, really great novels. But I think that the project, as we're about to talk about now, has some problems. And I'll talk about the good stuff too. Like I said, it's almost all good with some bad. First of all, I think that unlike Bleeding Edge, I think that the length gets in the way. This is Thomas Pynchon's longest novel, coming in at over 1,000 pages. I'm getting ready. Like I said earlier, we're rereading all the 3 large Thomas Pynchon novels in 2026 in the book club, and I'm already gearing myself up. And this is actually the easiest of all of them. This is a way easier read than Mason and Dixon and Gravity's Rainbow. But nonetheless, anytime you get into something that's going to be a 1,000-page slog, it's going to be a slog. Can't wait for William T. Vollmann's million-word novel that's apparently coming out next March. Shout out to him. I'm very excited for that. Sorry that my camera keeps going down. It gets overheated and I have to sit and wait. It's a whole thing. Anyway, So, yes, this is a slog. This is a long novel. And one of the other problems that makes it kind of harder is that there is no central protagonist driving force throughout this novel. And Pynchon, like I said, if you look at him, he really cares about these cornerstone movements. The end of Prohibition, the end of the hippie movement, the start of, the technological world. And Against the Day is about the world right before World War I. Because right before World War I, right before this massive amount of trauma, we were right there in the bridge between new and old. We were in a reality where mysticism and utopia and idealism and like literally inventing things, all this new stuff was possible. And so at the core of this novel, and like I said, there are so many different protagonists and, characters, but one of the core groups are the Travers family. And their father was this old school anarchist, like this Promethean type figure pushing back against the railroad companies and corporations. And the novel kind of turns into this Brothers Karamazov. I mean, like I said, the main thread of the novel, if I want to talk about, turns into this almost Brothers Karamazov situation where this man's three sons kind of move into three different modalities of the new world. One of them being physics, one kind of being more like an Alyosha, trying to be more centered, and another turning to violence. And these sons kind of link up the entire, many of the kind of novel's threads that are happening. And that's why I like this. It deals with these big problems, and we have this kind of core group, and we can kind of see the progression. And even though at times it feels disconnected, throughout the entire piece, we can see, for instance, like in one of these, how the study of light and optics and physics lead to things eventually like the nuclear bomb, but in terms of like that time, like photography, aviation. And of course, Pynchon doesn't look at this necessarily from like a very positive point of view, but one of like control. When we start to be able to have planes, we get to start bombing people and not have to have troops on the ground. When we start to have photographs, that's the start of the surveillance state. So really good stuff going on there. And so eventually, though, like this novel touches everything. It moves into espionage, mysticism. It traverses literally the entire world with its story, much like many Thomas Pynchon novels do. And I will admit, I feel like this one could be higher, but I haven't cracked the code yet. With Gravity's Rainbow, I've read it multiple times. I've had these companion guides, and the same attention hasn't been paid to Against the Day. And like I said, it could be mean. I could see on the next reread with a little bit more research, a little bit more thought, note-taking by me, discussions with the book club, all of this stuff, that we could really take this more to like a 90 or maybe even more. So I'm super excited to read this one. If you guys have more comments on this or any of these novels, just feel free to type them down below. If someone's going to be watching this video, they're going to be on this for, over an hour. And we'll have time to read some of the top comments, some of the rants, some of the stuff you disagree with. And so, yeah, type it out. And like the comments help me all the time. As you've seen, I react to comments in videos. I make videos because of comments. And so moving forward, next up on our list, we have V, Thomas Pynchon's first novel. And literally V is being used to hold up my camera right now, like to make it a little bit higher. So maybe I should go grab that. But I'm going to put V in here between Against the Day and Bleeding Edge. I feel like V is a solid, like somewhere between 80 and 85, like an 82 or an 83. And so this novel is great. Let me get it up. Because there's something that happens with an author's first novel. So authors we love on this channel, Cormac McCarthy and his first novel, The Orchard Keeper, Don DeLillo and his first novel, Americana, David Foster Wallace with the Broom of the System. They have these, their novels, those novels aren't anywhere as good as like their third or fourth or their masterpiece novels. Usually it's around the third or fourth novel where they really start to pick up steam and really kind of lean into their style. They don't have that finesse yet with their technique, but they are talented. They know they are talented, and many first-time authors know what they're trying to execute, but know it's not being executable. So what they do is they give more of themselves on the page. Because what's interesting when it comes to DeLillo, Pynchon, and McCarthy, and I see them running in parallel, is that they are all pretty reclusive authors. In recent years, in the last decade or two, McCarthy and DeLillo have been a little bit more accessible, but for most of their careers, they were basically not accessible. We didn't know very much about them except basic details, a random interview here or there, introductions by Pynchon and Slow Learner and whatnot. And so I think for someone like Pynchon, who I don't know if Pynchon, back in the early 1960s, imagined himself as someone who was going to be this reclusive superstar for the entirety of his career. And I think that writing Gravity's Rainbow, which basically made him an not overnight, but a multi-millionaire really fast, kind of enabled him to do that. If I throw millions of dollars in your face, you really can disconnect from society and do all that. But this is just my opinion, and I don't really think it affected his writing, but I feel like Pynchon, even though he wrote more accessible novels and novels basically about him, like Doc Sportello, which kind of is a mirror of what he was doing if you read Julie Siegel's piece on Pynchon and Playboy and about like his personal life and all this stuff, which is some of the most, one of the more, or really the most we know about Pynchon is from that article. But nonetheless, I feel like he lets a lot more of himself and his thoughts out in V, and later on starts to believe in that idea of reclusiveness and not sharing as much. Because when I read a novel like V, I'm like, yeah, this is some boy genius guy that worked at Harvard who has decided to become a novelist, and he has all this potential. So funny enough, throughout this entire video, I keep talking about these crises, these big moments in history. Well, Thomas Pynchon in V basically sets that as the postmodernist formula, because each chapter, I should say most chapters in this novel, take place in one of the big historical crises or moments in the 20th century. And so one half of the novel deals with this, one could say the hero of this novel, Benny Profane, and his whole sick crew. And I don't want to say that it's the vibes, because it's definitely not like the stylistic vibes of like an Inherent Vice and Doc Sportello, but it's just kind of this aimless group drinking, kind of being having debauchery go on, all of that type of stuff. But on the other side, we have these explorations in the past into Egypt, Malta, Africa, and all of them kind of surround and are chasing this phantom woman named V. And the concept is brilliant, because what Pynchon is chasing, and like I said, there's no resolution to any Pynchon novel. What, this V is, or maybe can be, and like I said, no spoilers here, but, some of the symbolic themes we are working with here that Pynchon is moving through, which once again are a little bit more direct in this novel, are, oh my God, we've already talked about them all: beauty, the machine, the empire, God, the feminine. But in these, the allegory that he runs them through is a little bit more, one could say, overt. So in some of these other novels, a lot of this stuff is a little bit more hidden. But in V, basically Pynchon, and without spoiling things here, mocks the feminine, creates these hybrid chimera type situations, characters, things that basically show the mess of modernity and of, the postmodern, post-World War II era. And like the symbols, which I won't, reveal, are very obvious. Like we had a book club on this a month or two ago, and we had a new reader to Pynchon, first Pynchon novel, somewhat new to classic literature, and they were like, I didn't really get too much of what was going on, but I got that symbolism. Like that was clear as day to me. And I feel like Pynchon at this point hadn't figured out that kind of the main theme that he was going to run through throughout the rest of his novels was going to be about information, and the corruption, of information through intelligence, or, this idea of paranoia and manipulation. There are threads of that in V, but after this novel, that kind of turns up. But rather, this novel talks about what modernity replaces, and this is why this novel reads so well even today, and why I really have it up here at an 85. In terms of execution, it's really more down at like in the mid to low 70s. But in terms of speaking to what matters, which is, what does all this replace? What does technology replace? Oh my God, my dishwasher is better, or something like that now. And the house I'm living in right now, so if you guys don't know, I quit my English teaching job and I had to downsize, like move into a much less expensive place, all of this stuff. And like our dishwasher doesn't work. Like it works, but it's so nasty, so old, and our landlord won't replace it. Like, oh my God. And so I'm washing dishes by hand now for the next 11 months. But not what technology replaces in that sense, but the meaning in our lives, even stuff like sex. I understand that, and we're going down a weird road here, that like sex toys and all this stuff have been around forever. But I have a buddy, this is a great story. This is actually like a very V type story. I have a buddy, and he's in a bad marriage right now, real bad. And up in his attic, he has a shrine. He has a $2,000 sex doll and has a shrine to her. And he goes up there and tells his wife, who apparently isn't that smart, that he's going up there to meditate. And he comes down all sweaty because it's in Las Vegas. He's meditating real hard up there. But he's got all these contraptions up there. And him and his wife no longer, consummate or, get together anymore or have any real relations. And I've known plenty of women who have become so desensitized with some of these devices that sex is no longer pleasurable to them. And I know countless men, because of pornography, who've become desensitized to sex, and their intimacy with their partner is very, very strained. Thomas Pynchon, this novel at some level speaks on a lot of that. Speaks on how technology and information, a lot of the stuff has ruined, these meaningful aspects of our life, ruined something that's, really could bring us together and is magical like sex, and turned it into something that's, not what it really is. And so our character, Benny Profane, is caught between trying to be fully human and also this world of the machine. He is this anti-hero who grew up watching the propaganda of the world wars, and slowly was, the first generation to die, because we're in this situation that we're all still in of, we want to care. We all want to do something. We all want to go out into the world and, be impactful. We've heard all the propaganda, make an impact, but we also know how asinine that sounds at times, and we don't want to be pessimists, but we're like, dude, what kind of impact am I making? Like, here I am, you guys, I'm years into this, and like, I've changed thousands of lives, if not tens of thousands, got thousands of people into writing for the first time, tens of thousands of people into reading, all of this stuff, but it feels like a drop in the ocean compared to like the lowering of consciousness that is going on. And so it can be really easy not to care. It can be really easy to turn off the blinders, shut off the television, act like Mildred in Fahrenheit 451, the wife. And so if you like Thomas Pynchon, like if you like a lot of his novels, there's a lot of that talk about random things. There's a lot of random things in this. Like I was, Shadow Ticket, was talking about jazz and this early music and swing. This novel has this. There's philosophy, crazy sexual stuff, history, like there's all this stuff coming in at once, and it's a really cool read. It's a little bit less direct than a Gravity's Rainbow. There's a little bit, I would say 20% less to learn. But this novel at the end of the day, is about this idea of the simulacra, the copy of the copy, the unreal, that the chase of that. And that's hard to capture in a novel. And once again, it's a visionary thing. When people tell me, I'll just keep revisiting this. I got more comments this morning. As you can see, I'm wearing a new outfit. Is Thomas Pynchon a psyop or not real? The only reason why he wouldn't be is I feel like true visionaries, true prophets, see the problems decades before they're going to happen. And, Jean Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation, wherever that book is, that inspired The Matrix, and much of his work, that happened decades later. A lot of this talk now of simulacra and all this stuff, which is kind of gotten propped up because of like video essay culture on YouTube and the elevation of Baudrillard and these other kind of postmodernist or sociological thinkers. A lot of people are thinking about this now, me included, and have been for a while now, thinking about, and it's on both sides. There's like the postmodernist side, but I've met like a lot of like sovereign citizen, libertarian, like anarchist types who also talk about this, how we're all not, we're all our social security number. We're not all, to become a citizen is to not be yourself anymore. Like all this crazy stuff, right? Pynchon was on the button with all this back in the day, back when people weren't really thinking about it. You know what I mean? Like we'd almost lost sight of that because things were so good. When you live in a society and you don't know you're in a control system yet, you don't know this military industrial complex and all these things are necessarily happening, it's much easier to not feel like you're in the machine. But now with like the existential dread of late stage capitalism and, polarization, all these things breathing down our necks, inflation, living a worse life than our parents, even though it feels like we're working harder. Like, dude, like I work harder than my dad ever had to, and I have way less. No offense to my dad. Like, he put in a lot of work, but I've been working full-time jobs, careers, and then doing side hustles, AKA this channel and my own writing 30, 40 hours a week after my normal job every single week for as long as it's been. My dad just went to work for 40 hours a week or whatever. And so to wrap things up, V almost feels like, I love first novels because they almost feel like posthumous novels. It feels unfinished. It feels like there are these threads, but you also get this, like I said, these ideas that, really in the middle when the masterpieces are happening, you don't really get. And so shout out to V, shout out to Thomas Pynchon. You could start here, it's a good place to start if you want to read through it in order. It's not the worst place to start because next on our list, which is actually a really, really good timing, we have The Crying Lot of 49. Ooh. And I'm going to put The Crying Lot of 49. Oof. I'm going to put it at a low A. It's like an 89 or a 90 in my head. So this novel historically is one that Pynchon didn't like because he was on a deadline and he didn't get to finish it. And at some level, it maybe prevented it from becoming a masterpiece. I don't know what that deadline meant in terms of if it would have been longer or more refined. I'm sure there would have been more length there. And my theory is that's why he brought back the female protagonist, Maxine in Bleeding Edge to kind of figure out what flesh out what he couldn't with Oedipus Mass. There's this kind of badass kung fu weird conception of women that Pynchon has with Oedipus Mass and Maxine that's somewhat silly, but just kind of cheesy and just kind of him, like whatever. And so this novel is about Oedipus Mass, and she gets basically executed, or I should say, given the job to execute this dead real estate mogul's estate. But along the way, she runs into this basically hidden mailing system called Waste, and it has this muted horn symbol that you guys see on the screen right here. And basically we get lost in this maze of her, figuring out other things, but also trying to discover if this thing actually exists. And this is this is such a beautiful allegory to kind of the post-war paranoia. V was building on this. Gravity's Rainbow takes this all the way, and Pynchon's other works, and explore the intelligence angle even more so with people who are like involved. But Pynchon knew once again and one of these themes that we hear about time and time again, that paranoia doesn't come from the city, doesn't come, we think of the guy in the middle of New York City like freaking out. It actually comes from suburbia. All of my friends who are wild dudes are mostly, these suburban kids who were basically constrained, didn't get in this. I could throw myself into this category. We didn't get to, go out and ride our dirt bikes, and live out on a plot of land, whether it was weird or not, or we weren't in the city and could see all these cool things. We had to drive. I lived 30, probably 25 minutes away from the Strip. Not that the Strip is a place for kids, but nonetheless, I was basically in this little pocket of a non-cultured part of North Las Vegas. And so out there, these things, these ideas, this tension, this angst really starts to build. And the problem is that, and this is where Pynchon is a genius, and this is where I've said, I was saying earlier in the video, that there are signals, we're out here walking in the dark, basically. Everyone out here who will tell you about whatever conspiracy and tell you if it's right, they have no idea what they're talking about. Even the U.S. government doesn't know what it's talking about a lot of the time. Like everyone is basically rolling around in the dark when they are talking about aliens, even religion, God. Like we are all just basically blind. But that doesn't mean there are true things out there that they're, if you look at the, just religion in general, you can see that there are truths that you can find, that every religion has found, that we're unconnected. And if you search deep into your heart, whether that's in meditation, psychedelics, prayer, whatever, you can say that is true. You know what I mean? And the same is true with many different things, many different types of power, many different things in this country. We can pinpoint and be like, something was wrong there. We can look at these major events and be like, we can see these pivot points, all of this stuff. But the problem is that when we go hunting for those conspiracies, for those ghosts, for those connections, things can get, one could say, sloppy. And throughout this, we get these angles like, this thing could be that. This thing could be like this Illuminati, multiple century group. It could be a revolutionary postal service. It could be this private language. There's like all this stuff. And this is what we talk about. This is how we sound. But the core and what Pynchon's talking about is what we believe, how we do this. And it's terrible allegory by me, comment, but it's like the medium is the message, and us searching, going out on this limb is a practice that is very dangerous, you guys. I've seen so many people who've fallen into delusion going down this path. And this novel is really asking us, can you walk down this path? Can you pay attention in society? Can you see these connections? Can you see all these connections and not lose it, not fall into aestheticizing it or commodifying it or going too far or ignoring it completely? How do you walk the line when there's so much crazy information out there, so much bait and switch simulacra and power games and all of this stuff, and you have to deal with it and somehow integrate it into your personal life, and not tell your wife like it's all a conspiracy, at dinner every single night, like and fucking lose it. You don't want to be like, Matthew McConaughey in True Detective season 1, but it could be all true. We're in a transmutation circle, And so it's weird because Pynchon does this reverse negation thing and reverse negation initiation thing in this novel with Oedipus Mass. She's picking up the scent. She's getting initiated with sex, with art, with pop culture, with drugs, with all this different stuff. She's like, almost following the path that you would think that, you need to become initiated into all this. And through this opening, she gets these revelations. She gets closer to the truth, but it's never, and like I said, I'm not really spoiling anything here. Pynchon makes this larger point that we love certainty in this age of rationalism and being able to, hop on, AI whenever you want or Google anything and get an answer and all this stuff and everything, all this stuff in this age of answers. When you go down into the layer of the unknown a little bit, certainty is almost impossible. And so what do you do out there? And who knows? Another thing I like, and this is something that continues in Gravity's Rainbow, huge theme from Pynchon is how media and sex combine, the programming of us through sex, through all of this stuff. What happens when you, I'll just say, watch pornography or do something like this, you're actually, like drugs, you're becoming more hyper-suggestible. You're opening yourself up emotionally. And even if you don't think you are, and what is coming in? What are you what are you bringing in? What are you letting yourself be programmed with? Sex, psychedelic drugs, these things were rituals. Like I just said, when you go do ayahuasca, you eat a clean diet. They tell you, don't try to consume media. Don't do this for days after. Try to hold yourself back from it. But I know so many people, as they're listening to Pink Floyd and watch, or watching a trippy movie or some of this stuff when they're on psychedelics, they are getting the culture. And the same is true with sex, especially if you're, being promiscuous and doing it, and that could be said, you're just opening yourself randomly every single day with pornography or in person with, random women, or one could say even at your own home, there's something going on there where it's opening the emotional, spiritual, psychic veil. Look at any culture and how one of these truths is the spiritual energy of sex, brahmacharya, whatever culture you want to talk about it with, but spiritual, it's a two-way road. And what are you bringing back in? Well, that's everything in your environment. And so this novel really hits on that too. If you're at like the start of the book, there's a beautiful scene, like not beautiful, very odd sexual stuff happening with the TV running, like all this stuff, really amazing. And so this has to get an A on my list because of all this stuff. It's really captured. It's short. It's, this is Thomas Pynchon's shortest novel. And to be able to capture all this, is amazing. And this is more relevant now. Like I said, when you're a visionary, this novel is more important now than it was back then because we're really dealing with it now. You can't escape it now. If you have a phone, if you have a computer, it's everything. It's all right there, dude. And so it definitely gets an A on my list. And so next up we have Mason and Dixon, Pynchon's historical novel. And I'm going to throw this up here. This is hard. I'm going to throw this up here in an S tier, I feel like won't be a canonical piece of literature only because it came out at the wrong time. I think if Mason and Dixon, I think Thomas Pynchon started this in the 1970s. I feel like if, let's just say for whatever reason, he finished it, released it in like 1975 and 1976, it would have rocked the industry. But the problem is by 1997, when this novel comes out, we are basically in the Pynchon nightmare. Infinite Jest had one last big push, but literary fiction novels and then becoming masterpieces that sold millions of copies, it was done by then, especially a historical novel that isn't easy to read. It's somewhat esoteric. Like it really is then and now a bad combination for commercial success. And unfortunately, once again, canonization is also dependent on readers to really push things in to like, okay, Canonization also, it has a relation to reputation and, the amount of tenacity and energy that the fans of this novel kind of put behind it. And unfortunately, Gravity's Rainbow, did sell millions of copies. The Crying Lot of 49 was a successful commercial novel. And I don't know that over the past 25 years and in 1997, there was a strong enough readership base to really push Mason and Dixon into these conversations, because I am in the literary world, everyone. I am reading about literature and hearing you guys talk about literature and doing this as a full-time job, and basically have been for over a decade now. And this novel does not get mentioned anywhere near where it should. And I could take my own bias and my own, love of Pynchon out of the equation and say that if the average reader actually read this and put the energy into it, first of all, I don't know if the average reader could finish it, but if they did, this would be near the top of their list. And so that is why it is up here in the S tier, because it should be in the canon, but I don't know if it's really going to make it. And so let's hop into the novel now. So one of the things that really is striking about this novel, and it's something I mentioned with Bleeding Edge, that kind of shows Pynchon's strengths as a writer, is that this is written in 18th century English, which, if trying to write an entire novel, and especially an 800-page novel in an English dialect and being able to get away with it and make it interesting is a really hard thing to do, honestly. There have been many novels that have gone halfway with this, but from what I know about 18th century English, it is a almost perfect execution. And if you know more than I do and you think that it wasn't executed, please feel free to leave a comment down below ranting and telling us why Pynchon didn't get it right. Another thing that makes this story interesting is that it's a frame narrative, that this is a retelling of the account of Mason and Dixon's biographies from this reverend named Cherrycoke, who says that he went with, Mason and Dixon on their journey, which also is an interesting kind of addition to kind of the Pynchon bibliography, because there haven't been, I'm trying to think through it, I don't know if any of these novels are like traditional frame narratives. But I'm pretty sure everything else is just an embedded narrative or like just has some good subplot stuff going on. And so one of the reasons why this novel is so good is that Mason and Dixon are similar individuals, but also starkly different, with Mason being kind of this quiet, grieving astronomer after the death of his wife, and Dixon being this more loudmouth type of surveyor. And, with this contrast, we don't end up with this Shrek and Donkey situation, but rather kind of two sides of philosophy and science, personality, and of the times that can kind of refract or open up kind of the critiques and some of the ideas that Pynchon is talking about in this novel. Because both these characters travel down to South Africa to witness the transit of Venus. And that's the main idea. But between all of that, what do you think you'd run into if you took a boat from, Britain down to South Africa? Well, you'd run into slavery, you'd run into all these crazy mystics, you'd run into the colonizers, all different types of indigenous people, revolutionaries. And I love how this is all written from the perspective of the times. Something that really fails in another novel. I don't know if any of you guys are fans of Neil Stephenson out there. He wrote Cryptonomicon, Snow Crash, and then Quicksilver. And if you've ever read Quicksilver, which loosely is about, the name slipping my mind right now, that really exclusive club of scientists in the Enlightenment and Restoration period. It's slipping my mind right now. But the novel follows like Isaac Newton and talks about all this different stuff, but it just is so flat. I remember I used to run a book club in Vegas with just a bunch of my buddies and people I'd meet, and I selected this. I was like, ooh, Neil Stephenson, right? This is going to be so good. And all of us hated it. Like 5 of us out of the 10 didn't finish it. And it was like, I barely got through it, and just because I was leading the group. And, it's somewhat hard to talk about, first of all, scientific topics. Cormac McCarthy tried this in The Passenger, to talk about these things and make it interesting. Thomas Pynchon does this again in Against the Day, which I kind of talked about earlier. But in this, I at times it's hard to read. And this is where kind of the hard to read stuff comes in. There are some problems on that end, but I felt fascinated by it. I really was invested in a lot of this stuff, even if I wasn't necessarily understanding it or wasn't really prompted to research it, because just almost the genuine curiosity, the thinking, the period, this idealism, not the philosophical strain, but just like toward life that these men have, and like some of the energy in these conversations between many of these events and side quests and ghost encounters and all of this other stuff is absolutely wonderful. Some of the more lucid writing on, some of these topics, which are really important, really are the cornerstone to everything. And you're finding it in this novel, a modern novel. And once again, it comes back to this idea that so many dudes who know all this information in 2025 do not have the artistic ability and sentiment to be able to get this down in a way that matters and people would want to actually read. And I love like some of these direct allegories and ideas about measuring the world and light. And that usually creates this idea, just within it, the idea itself of separation, of time moving past, as they're moving past these slavers and, experiencing all this stuff, you can see that they're surveying the world. They're taking us into the new age. But Pynchon shows the undercurrent of what's building that new age. Genius stuff. And he shows, people talk about the Enlightenment period and everything that went wrong with rationalism and all of this stuff and where we're at today. But, going back to this time is such a smart idea. In Gravity's Rainbow, we finally, get to see it playing out in full. But like I said, in this novel, things are a little bit more black and white, a little bit more stark in their contrast. And I think that's important. That's what we read history for. And so this will help you kind of dive deeper and help your mind get filled up with this time in history. A lot of us know about what was going on in England. We know about the Enlightenment period, the Restoration, all of that. We know about, what's going on in Europe. We know what's going on in America with the Revolutionary War. We know about the slavers. We know about the transatlantic slave trade, colonization, but we don't really know about the in-betweens. And where do you read a novel about that? Or a history book about that? And, there are plenty of places to look, but there's only so much time, you guys. I read over 150 books per year, and I don't think I've read a book dedicated to this time period in this place across that. At least 24 of those are history books each year. And it's partially because there isn't too much information. You can get these academic texts or these things, but there is nothing like epic in terms of like a book that would be maybe entertaining or like really awesome to read, because it's in the stories, it's in these conversations, it's in the idiosyncratic ideas and people and the clashing of cultures and colonization and all of this different stuff. That's what's interesting, especially when we get to see the boots on the ground, the people, their spirit, the ghosts, whatever it is. And so that's why this novel is an S tier novel for me. This did make me more intelligent. It did open up my heart. And when a novel can do both of those things and it challenges me, I feel like, wow, like I'm breathing, like I have like trained at altitude when I'm done with it. That's what I'm talking about. And it integrates all this stuff. This is the type of novel that Tolstoy, when he writes War and Peace, couldn't do. He, love Tolstoy, love War and Peace. It's an A tier for me, probably not an S tier. I'd put Anna Karenina up there. But he resorts to these long-winded rambles or analyses of the war and all this stuff. And many classic novels do this. They can't figure out, they don't have the imaginative capability yet to bring it all together into something. And that's what Mason and Dixon does, probably better than any historical novel. Because there are historical novels that are awesome to read because they are a period piece and you get to read about this period that maybe you're interested in or really is cool. Or there are others that are just like wild when it comes to style, some like a Blood Meridian, even though that's a cool time period, but just the style is like, whoa, and the content's crazy. This brings it all together. When you can get one that has both, and I would actually throw Blood Meridian into that category, that's when things really start to happen. And what makes this cooler is, like I said, it's an unknown period. So you feel like you're exploring. You don't know what's coming around the next corner. As in something like Blood Meridian, it's just cowboys and Indians, just another story, another day, So Mason and Dixon is awesome. I would recommend everybody go check it out. I really wouldn't probably put this one first on the list to read. And so next on our list we have, let me catch this, we have Vineland. I'm going to put this right up here, about an 85, I would say. We'll put up Leonardo right here because I know so many people who aren't going to read the book or just want to see my rating of this because they saw the movie and are skipping around this video. And so I understand. So we'll make sure that there is a signal out there for you to come to. So Vineland, though, we just covered this in the Right Conscious Book Club. This was the last book we talked about. I think it was only 2 or 3 weeks ago. And man, oh man, I love this book. You know, I kind of talked about all this in some of my other videos, and I've talked about intelligence stuff and Thomas Pynchon countless times on this channel. So I don't want to say it all again. But this idea that everyone in the hippie movement basically got ousted, that everyone turned into snitches or yuppies, and it failed because of that, is so strong. And there's so much resentment and bitterness toward all that. And Pynchon really captures that multi-generational divide and the fallout of that. You know, Inherent Vice is the direct fallout. I feel so weird. I need to switch this image of the hippie movement. But Vineland shows what happens once that culture, that group of people has been commodified, has been kicked down the road, what that culture has been turned into after 20 years, 15 years of television. I may be wrong here, but between 2010 and 2025, we had a lot of shifts. But by 2010, social media, YouTube, a lot of the stuff, things like Instagram, TikTok weren't up yet. But the change, every 15 years is a long time, between 1955 with, Elvis or whoever was running around and, Jimi Hendrix was crazy. And the jump from 1970 to 1985, when this novel takes place, was wild too, because by then television had taken over. America had basically fallen into this deep slumber, this deep state of power. But the cracks were starting to open up, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, all this stuff with Nixon. We're starting to kind of put chinks into the armor. The economy was, finally slowing down. Even though it was revving back up again, we were starting to see the roots of like what we're dealing with now. And this novel starts with Zoid Wheeler, which we don't really necessarily, starts with Zoid Wheeler, crashing his car to get his disability check. And it's this massive critique, once again, as we were talking about for like the 10th time in this video, of simulacra, of our obsession, of the system, of bureaucracy. And a lot of people say this wasn't as good as Gravity's Rainbow and The Crying Lot of 49, and here I am ranking it lower. But a lot of that stuff that we see in this, first of all, isn't as present because it's shorter than Gravity's Rainbow, and it doesn't have kind of the oomph conspiracy head like stuff of The Crying Lot of 49, where we can all get into it and like try to figure it out and like tap into this what is belief question, which is so important. But with Vineland, like for instance, there's this whole ninja subplot. And it's so genius because, I think Pynchon realized that, occulting, just small bits of information and embedding a couple things is much better than embedding 500 different things. And so throughout this novel, there is this obsession, one could call it, with surveillance and visibility. The state wants to control everything, and the people, play into that by wanting to see everything, by tuning into the news, by snitching on everybody. Brock, the villain of the story, has files, he has cameras, he has informants, but there's this group of ninjas that come in at these random times, which, like I said earlier, Pynchon has this weird thing with like ninjas, kung fu, like Bruce Lee, like he has this old school, like, I have this racist neighbor, right? I used to when I lived in Las Vegas, just like super racist, but he'd be out taking out the trash or walking to the mail, he'd corny and start talking to you. He's just crazy dude. But he'd tell you these stories about, Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal and how they could kick John Jones's ass and all this stuff. Like I remember one time, like he was telling me, I was like, look at this. I'm showing him like a John Jones highlight reel. He's like, Bruce Lee would kill him. Like we've all met those like nerds before. Like there's a lot of weird dudes who believe in that stuff. We've never been to a jiu-jitsu class before and been like, oh my God, there's like levels to this game. But nonetheless, the ninjas in this novel, though, they're invisible. They strike, they come, and nobody can see them. They are the antithesis. They are the outgrowth of this all-seeing eye, this all-seeing society. One could say in our technological world, these are the hackers. This is anonymous. These are the forms of resistance that can't be taken over because they can't be seen. They can't be tracked. These are the guys illegally streaming whatever football game is going to be on tomorrow, the UFC. And it's interesting because if you look at the 1960s and you look at that culture and earlier in the video, I went on at least a 10-minute rant talking about how we're like basically just redid what the 1960s were. If you think the 60s had these huge marches, we had the civil rights marches, we had all these protests in the late 60s. We had the Black Panthers out there holding guns. Like it was all about media and spectacle. We had all these crazy, progressive musicians, with the radio and all this stuff. There were all these new methods of distribution. But the problem is when you have all that out there, it's easy to infiltrate it. It's easy to document it. It's easy to neutralize different parties and control the entire thing. Just like today, when you have access to everyone's data and can take anyone down on, either true charges or false charges with their digital footprint, you're in total control of them. And so the only thing that we have left is, in our world, especially now with the cameras everywhere, is this world of invisibility, doing these random acts online, under not just, VPNs, but like VPNs on VPNs, under Tor, under this, under that, just endless, encryption stuff. And so that stuff is absolutely great. Another big thing about this novel that puts it high on this list is this idea of forgetting. And this is so paramount because Pynchon talks about these people in the 1960s like, damn, we did that. We were there. We people talk about it. People are so scared. Like if you listen to political commentary on both sides of the aisle right now, everyone's like, oh my God, we don't want this to be the 60s and 70s again where everyone's dying. Like people are scared of that. But if you think about it, if you lived through that, if you were a part of those groups, maybe you weren't killing people, but if you were out there risking it, making your voice heard or putting your, ass on the picket line or whatever, you had some skin in the game. Let's be honest here. And so as time moves on, though, these people forgot, by the 1980s, they're all yuppies. They're all comfortable. Now, and with the boomers and stuff, they're all comfortable. They don't care. They just want more of the status quo. But something similar is even more scary happening with us. This is things that literature can talk about that, Neil Postman and Technopoly and all these think tank and all these thinkers writing books about technology can't really drive the point about is there's this idea of forgetting. And on the other side of that, there's, something that's really connected to that, which is my favorite word in literature is longing. When we feel a novel that turns up the nostalgia machine and is really good, what it does a lot of the time is make us long. It makes us feel. It's like really good at all of that. And so this novel talks about if forgetting is inevitable. And in our time, are we going to forget? And we already have what pre-technological life was like. I grew up in it. I grew up having DSL internet and, no video games for years. I was 7, 8, 9 years old. And even though I was really young, it seems like a dream to me, you guys. It seems like it doesn't exist. That the only times I played video games when I went to my grandma's house and played like the old school Nintendo. It seems like a dream to me, everyone. And so this novel really, drives that point home. It's something the movie I think missed out on a lot. It's something I don't think movies can really capture as well as novels because it's this feeling of interiority. It's this feeling of betrayal. It's this feeling of isolation. It's this feeling that you and I know about right now where we're like, am I the only one? We have a couple friends, some people online. Am I the only one that remembers, that wants to be free of this technocratic prison that we're all in? Really good stuff, and this novel makes it feel like it's a betrayal to forget. And that's why it's transformative to me. That's why it's really good. That's why even though there are a lot of gags and it's not as strong as some of these other novels, that's why Vineland is, I'll call anything that gets into my B tier a masterpiece, man. And so let's go, everyone. So we got one more on the list. So we got Slow Learner right here. I'm going to put that down here at the low C. Just a quick comment on that. It's Thomas Pynchon's older short stories. The best part of that is him commentating on them. I'm not the biggest fan on those short stories, even though they do kind of talk about parts of himself that he doesn't normally talk about or write about. But next we have Shadow Ticket, and I'm going to throw Shadow Ticket down here in the C category. And so I've talked about Shadow Ticket a ton this week, and I did an hour review, 30 minutes of no spoilers and 30 minutes of spoilers on Shadow Ticket if you want a deeper dive. But why am I putting it down here? Because it doesn't have the oomph. It doesn't have that real feeling of, like I said, you can look at these Pynchon novels multiple different ways. You could look at it from this way of trying to feel and explore information and the limits of knowing and all of this stuff and all these different rabbit holes. Shadow Ticket, because it has this unmotivated protagonist doesn't really get into a lot of the things that Pynchon's other novels higher on the list get into. In terms of like knowing and expansive knowing, especially in this time, I don't feel like I came away with a lot. Honestly, I don't really feel like I went and experienced all these different things that I would experience in V or in Against the Day, or even, in something like Inherent Vice. I didn't really feel connected to the time or connected to this idea of knowing. On the other side, in terms of transformative elements and, ideas speaking to us that can help us now or help us reflect on that time more, a lot of that also isn't present. And so all that we have left is just Thomas Pynchon, who we all like, especially if you're an hour or whatever into this video. All we have left is him talking about this really cool time and, writing all these songs out and doing all these cool things. And, there's a lot of fun parts of this novel, but the things that I really appreciate in a novel that I really feel like make them great, that I feel like make them compete with some of the greatest novels behind me, whether that's on an entertaining point of view, on the pulpy side of things, for a good crime novel, we're talking about James Ellroy, Walter Mosley, got the Walter Mosley right here, like whatever it is, it isn't there in Shadow Ticket. And it wasn't there necessarily in an Inherent Vice either, but Inherent Vice had enough color to it, had enough pizzazz to it that it almost broke into the B category. It also doesn't have these transformative elements, the type of thing you would find in a Crying Lot of 49 or even Vineland, some of the stuff I just talked about, the Dostoevskys, the Tolstoys, all of this stuff. It doesn't have that element either. And maybe it does, and I'm just not getting it, but I haven't really I've read every single review. I haven't really seen anybody tackle or find anything where I don't feel like they're really stretching it. The only stuff that could qualify for that is like people try to compare it to time, like as a critique of fascism in the modern era. And that really isn't clicking for me, because Pynchon started this novel before Donald Trump even decided that he wanted to be the president. And so that's not happening for me. And so I would recommend this novel to people. It's probably his most accessible novel. It's really easy to read. It has gags, it has some love affairs, it has some mafia stuff going on, but I just really don't feel like it's a home run, and it really doesn't feel like I said, when I can compare it to things on both sides of the aisle, like it should be up there in the B category. And so those are my rankings, you guys. This was a ridiculously long video that took me forever to film. And so I'm glad to finally have this one done. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for all the support. I love each and every one of you guys. And I will see each and every one of you guys very soon in my next Pynchon video, which should be dropping sometime in the next few days. And if not, if you are watching this years in the future, I will have hundreds of videos on Thomas Pynchon down in the playlist below. And so have fun watching some of those. Say hello to me in the present, and I will see you guys very soon.